we are coming back on the concept of the ecosystem. Like we saw earlier, there are different types of the ecosystem. There can be an artificial ecosystem, a natural ecosystem, an aquatic ecosystem, and a terrestrial ecosystem. Under this ecosystem, there are a lot of organisms, living organisms, and non-living things. So the relationship in the ecosystem is all about feeding relationship. This is a feeding, it's a feeding relationship. How do human beings get his food? How do lions get their food? How do plants survive? Okay, that's what we are going to look to under this concept, relationships in the ecosystem. And like I said, it's a feeding relationship. In the ecosystem, we actually have different organisms are grouped under different categories depending on their feeding characteristics. Okay? The organisms can be grouped depending on their feeding manners. Okay, this concept, when we say the organisms can be grouped depending on whether they get their own food, where they feed, so it means their source of food. Their source of food is the main character when grouping organisms in the ecosystem. So under those groups we can have different groups. We can have what we call producers. Like the word says, they are producers. They are organisms which manufacture their own food. They manufacture their own food. In other words, they are autotrophs. Here are a great example, a big example here. They are green plants, e.g. they are green plants. Green plants manufacture their own food and they are grouped under the category of the producers. The second category is the category of consumers. Under this category, we find organisms that feed on other organisms. They can feed on producers or they can feed on other animals. So they do not make their own food. Instead, they consume other organisms. They feed on other organisms. And the last category is the category of decomposers. The decomposers break down the rich feeding materials. They break down rich organic materials into simple food molecules that they can ingest. So these are three categories of organisms under the ecosystem according to their feeding relationship. For the consumers, there are a lot of examples. We can say human being, so we are now going to explain all this. Now, starting from the producers, we saw the definition. The producers consist of all organisms that manufacture their own food. Examples, we said green plants, they convert carbon dioxide into the glucose that they use for their energy source. So the second category that we saw was the consumers. In other words, they are called heterotrophs, because they of course does not manufacture their own food. And to categorize them, they are under this category of consumers, different kinds of consumers. We can have primary consumer, can have secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, their students, and the quaternary to specify this. The primary consumer, they feed on the producers. The secondary consumer feed on primary consumers. Tertiary consumer feed on the secondary consumers. And the quaternary consumers feed on the tertiary consumers. And lastly, for example, here we can say, for example, I'm going to give an example. For the primary consumer, we can say, like, let's say a certain bird, yes, that can feed on green plants. This bird can be eaten, for example, by a certain rat. This rat can be eaten, for the second point, by the cat, yes. This cat can be eaten by the owl. As the cycle continues, we go to the third category of the decomposers, which decompose all this, whether they are producers, consumers, they decompose all them. The decomposers, the examples like fungi, microscopic fungi, or whether they are bee fungi, we can have protista and the other microbes like alga, yes, small alga, and lastly bacteria. So it's under all this that we have what we call the food chains. The food chain. How is this is eaten by this, eaten by this, eaten by this, up to the decomposers. We make the food chain out of them. Out of this we make the food chains. So food chain it's a simple representation, of feeding relationship. So this food chain shows how energy comes from one organism to the next. For example, can have organism A can transfer energy to organism B, can transfer energy to organism C, to organism D, and to organism E. This means A, like we said, is the producer. It's the producer A. B is the first. Consumer. C is the secondary consumer. D is the tertiary or the third consumer, and E can be the quaternary consumer, dear students. This shows that A is eaten by B, B is eaten by C, C is eaten by D, and D is finally eaten by E. So all this is what we call a food chain, a simple representation of feeding relationship in the ecosystem, or we can say it shows how energy is transferred from one organism to the next in the ecosystem. I'm going to show you another example, an example of organisms that can make a simple food chain. You can have, for example, an aquatic plant, that is eaten by a fish, a small fish. This small fish can be hunted and be eaten by a frog. This frog is eaten by a crane. It's a type of a bird. And this crane can be eaten by a hawk. This shows that an aquatic plant is the producer, a fish is the primary consumer, this frog is the secondary consumer, this crane is the tertiary consumer, and the hawk is the quaternary consumer, like we said. So we are now moving to the food web. Another concept called the food web. The food web. So dear students, what the food web? Anyone? Yes, that's good. The food web is an interconnection. That's why we say it's a web. A web is an interconnection of a lot of food chains. Food web is an interconnection. Connection of several food chains makes a food web. Actually, in reality, a simple food chain does not exist, because this kind of chain does not exist. It's a theoretically, but in reality we have food webs. One organism can eat this organism and be eaten by another organism. So a lot of food chains, different food chains, can make a very big food web in a certain ecosystem. For example, dear students, using the letters we used earlier, we can say A can be eaten by B, eaten by C, eaten by D, eaten by E. From these organisms, we can have A can be eaten as well by F, F can be eaten by C, F can be eaten by where? By G, okay? G can be eaten finally by E, and G can eat another organisms, which can be, for example, Z. So this is a food web which is different from the food chains that we saw earlier. The organisms here, when we say it can be eaten by, we don't use lines, we use arrows. This arrow shows that organism is eaten by. Do not be deceived and use lines, we use arrows. So this makes a mere food web from different food chains. So we are going to look at a very clear example of a food web. We are ending by example of a food web. Here an example can have a hawk which can be eating a rabbit, and the rabbit is feeding on wild flowers. So dear students, you can see that on our food web we have a lot of interconnected food chain. We have wildflowers that are being eaten by mouse. Mouse is also feeding on grass. This mouse is being fed by the snake, which is being fed by hawk, and the snake is also feeding on the rabbit. This shows that we have a lot of interconnected food chains in this simple food web. It is through this food web that I'm going to base on my assignment. To end this session, I will base my assignment on this food chain, on this food web. I mean, you will construct for me three food chains from this food web. Okay? Construct 3 food chains from the above food web. Okay, dear students, this is it for today. We will move to the next topic under the concept of ecosystem. But if you missed the previous topics, you just go on this YouTube channel. You just search for the rest videos, Ikaramu TV, and don't forget to subscribe. And go to the www.ubumenyi.net for more details, assignments, the correction of assignments. You will see a lot of better things. And good luck, you guys, in going through all this. Thank you, ULU Teacher Richard.